Joining me now from Washington, D.C. is the always insightful Adam Creighton. Adam, thank you for your time tonight. I want to ask you about the modelling, both here in Australia and overseas. One thing that has been pretty consistent is that the modelling has been spectacularly wrong. Just wildly wrong on deaths, on hospitalisations, on case numbers, and always wrong in the one direction, Adam.
Yes, look, that's certainly true, Rita. And I think the fundamental reason for this is the models are quite simplistic. They're very naive. They assume that people don't change their behaviour in the face of new information. But of course, all human beings change their behaviour. And so that's why you've got these extraordinary, pessimistic, as you point out, assumptions about deaths and hospitalisations. And then the other way, the second way the models fail, is they are very short term. They assume that after you lock down, the virus is gone. Whereas, of course, as we well know now, certainly in Victoria, after five and a half lockdowns, when you lift a lockdown, the virus comes back very quickly. So it's certainly not a long-term solution.
Has there been any reckoning or accountability for these modelling errors? Can we have some confidence now that the modelling the government's going to be relying on in Australia to reopen the country is going to be a little bit more accurate?
No, look, sadly we can't, and I don't think there has been a reckoning at all. I think the media still goes to the same scientists whose models have been basically hopeless for decades. I mean, the most famous, of course, is Neil Ferguson in the UK, who's been forecasting in an extremely pessimistic way with numbers that have turned out hopelessly wrong by magnitudes for decades. And yet, of course, it was his model back in March 2020 that plunged the Western world basically into lockdown, when he forecast that there would be millions and millions of deaths in the US and the UK if there wasn't a lockdown. Of course, that was shown very, very quickly to be wrong. And the reality is this thing's very hard to model because there's so many variables and the data is not necessarily fantastic. So I think what we need from our leaders is a lot more humility about what they know and about what they can achieve.
And some of that modelling, I guess it's fantastic that a country like Sweden exists because they're their test case. They're the ones who went from the start, we're not locking down, we're not going to place these onerous restrictions. And the modelling, and I'm not saying they haven't had some deaths there, they certainly have, and more than some of their Scandinavian neighbours per capita, but not the hundreds of thousands or millions that some of those models would have predicted.
Yeah, certainly that's right. I think the world owes enormous gratitude to Sweden, for generations to come. And not just Sweden, within the United States, you could make the same argument about Florida and Texas to some extent. But you're quite right. The deaths per capita in Sweden are roughly in line with the rest of Europe. They don't stand out. And as you pointed out, they did not lock down at all. The forecasts were something like 96,000 deaths in Sweden from the Neil Ferguson model that we just discussed earlier. And of course, they ended up with about 15,000, slightly less than 15,000 deaths. And it must be stressed that, of course, while all deaths are very sad, 1/3 of those deaths were for people aged over 90. So clearly, biologically, they didn't have too many years to go. So everything's got to be put in context, and it simply wasn't any sort of Armageddon in Sweden whatsoever. Deaths basically were in line with 2015 levels.
Well, that's it. But there weren't that difference from some previous years in the last decade. So that was quite surprising, I've got to say. But there was this fascinating piece in a scientific journal about people's attitude to lockdown. Psychologists found lockdown in itself was a primary reason why so many people were willing to abide by the rules and be scared of the virus. They believe the threat must be severe if the government imposes such drastic measures. It's a fascinating insight into the human psyche.
Certainly it is, Rita. That was very interesting, and it explains so much to me. I mean, one of the salient facts of this whole pandemic is that people think the virus is far, far deadlier than it actually is. If you ask people in Australia, the UK, the US, the surveys all say the same thing, that the people think it's about 10 to 100 times more lethal than it is, that in some cases it's wiped out, hundreds of thousands in their own population, millions in some cases. And interestingly, young people are more scared of it than older people, when of course, as you know, that's the opposite of the reality. And I think it can be explained because of these lockdowns scare people themselves. The virus doesn't scare people. The lockdowns scare people because people think, well, look, if the government's doing this extraordinary thing, which it's never done in history, then it must be really, really bad. Because let's face it, most people don't pay attention to the scientific journals or look at the facts too much. They're just aware that they've been forced to stay in their home, and they think, wow, if that's the case, this must be horrific. And so that in itself has caused the misinformation, in my view. So you've got this hysterically scared population because of the lockdowns, not because of the virus.
Well, the polling in Australia and elsewhere in the States all paints the same picture. The people overstate the risks quite dramatically, like you mentioned, by factors of 10, 100. And that in itself is shocking because we've had such intense coverage on one issue and yet there's such ignorance out there about the reality. Now, one issue that has barely received any coverage is the fact that just about every advanced nation in the world abandoned its sophisticated pandemic plans, the plans they had in place, and followed China to lock down, to eradicate the virus. You've written about this. Just take me through that. How can every country ignore what they had planned to do in a crisis like this and follow China and trust China's data?
Yes, look, I think it's extraordinary. I think it's the most difficult and profound question that our societies face right now, and I haven't been able to get a satisfactory answer from any serious person on this. It's certainly true, as you point out, that the UK, Australia, US, all the Western countries had pandemic plans. Some of them are written very recently to explain to governments and to societies what to do in the case of a very serious pandemic. Pandemic in some case far worse than the one we've just experienced. I mean, for instance, in the UK plan from 2011, they assumed a flu pandemic where 350,000 people died, which of course is far, far more, roughly double, I think, than have died in the UK from COVID. And in all of these plans, they never ever said to lock your society down for months on end, let alone multiple times, like in the case of Victoria. That was really something we saw China do. And the rest of the world thought, all right, well, if they can do it, then maybe we can do it too. It seems to work. Of course, famously, the China data, the number of deaths just suddenly levelled off, and so it looked like it worked. I mean, it certainly hasn't worked in the US because there's not a single jurisdiction where you can honestly say there's been a statistically significant difference in the death or case rate after you introduce a lockdown. You just can't see it in the data. So it's a faith-based policy, if you like, with extraordinary collateral damage. So yes, we have changed our pandemic plans in a very major way, very sadly, in my view.
Absolutely, and the US example is very illuminating as well, particularly when you compare states like Florida and Texas that were open and New York, which locked down long and hard, and the examples are there and they should be studied. Adam Creighton, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thanks very much, Rita.